So going back to that subject, that's where we get a lot of even, like you mentioned, like the Me Too movement, for instance, or different things where women will gang up and they'll agree, or they'll give false accusations, and they'll try to paint someone as bad because they feel like, well, I'm taking down a bad guy. And even if it's not based in the truth, it's like, well, but my other friends will accept me, and I'm going to be, propped up by them. And I don't want to be seen as the person going against the flow. And you end up with all these destructive sub movements that have came out of feminism, simply based on this idea. And not just the Me Too movement, but we obviously have other movements too, like the fat acceptance movement, the whore acceptance movement, right? Like, because it's like, you're fat, but slay queen, and fat is beautiful. And women are less likely to really want to stand up, go against the flow, use their gut instinct, just say, no, fat's ugly, fat's disgusting. If the mob is going in a direction, that's where women are likely to go. And this is one of the gynocentric negatives that I find in society. This is where cancel culture comes from, where mob mentality comes from. This is where so many of these underlying movements, these woke movements, the right claims to want to fight against, come from gynocentrism. It comes from a lack of men just saying, no, who cares if 99 people are saying something's true? If they don't have evidence, if they're not producing evidence, and they don't have evidence behind what they're saying, then they might be wrong. And I'm willing to stand up and say, I might be the last person, like with the lockdowns, with COVID, etc., that I might be saying they're wrong, and I might not have anyone on my side, but I'm going to keep fighting for what's right, because it's a masculine tendency. And so it is crazy that people think, well, it's just feminism. What harm does it do? Not everyone wants to be in a family. Women raise kids fine. But really, all of society is now in this feminine energy, this feminist energy, I should say, which is misplaced, right? It's feminine energy should be pushed towards mothering, towards nurturing, towards looking out for the home. And you brought up something really interesting. I would say one of the factors that mostly combats this, that puts us back in our roles, would be Christianity. And there's a lot of talk recently about, with Michael J. Knowles, he said that we should eradicate transgenderism. And the left media got so upset saying, okay, he said he wanted to eradicate transgenders. It would have been based if he said that, but he didn't. He actually just said this equivalent of, I don't want to eradicate cancer patients. I want to eradicate cancer, right? So that's different. And the left goes, well, what if we made a war against Christianity? Would you be happy? And I'm like, bro, that's what the entire culture war has been. And it looks like it's not it's not a modern advancement. You talked a lot about how feminism, finds its root from people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who actually very early on, back in the late 1800s, with other feminists, actually started by rewriting the Bible, started by attacking Christianity. I never heard that before. Can you explain that to me?
Yeah, isn't that crazy? We never get told this. We hear about Susan B. Anthony and how great she was, and Trump even gave her a post-mortem pardon for when she was arrested for, her activism. But first of all, the reason that you don't know any of this history, and the reason it sounds crazy to people when I say this, and like, that can't be true. That can't be true. I would know about it. When the Ford Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation kind of united to create gender studies in the late 1960s, right around 1970, they created this department and this new academic field of study to put in major universities around the country at the time, in order to literally rewrite the history. And this is not my opinion. They tell you this in their own white papers. That's who's my source in my book. That's who I cite. They brag about the fact that they created gender studies and women's studies to rewrite history from the standpoint of the oppressed woman. And they call this standpoint feminism. So that's why the common understanding now is women have always been oppressed. Life for women was slavery before 1919, and it was so unjust, and they were so marginalized and so oppressed. That's not really true. And I take a couple of chapters to demonstrate all the different ways that women really weren't oppressed, and all the things they were in fact doing and didn't get punished for or marginalized for at all. So that's the reason that you don't know it, is because they literally rewrote the history from the standpoint of a radical Marxist feminist. But the true history is that women had plenty of influence in society even though they might not have been like leadership positions. They're not senators, governors, CEOs, or anything like that, but they had a tremendous amount of influence by being the backbone of every community, of every church, of every family, of when we used to have close-knit communities filled with different families that were all very intermixed and knew each other very well, and people were so much more connected. Women had tremendous influence. And what feminism did was actually threw that balance off. And one of the arguments I frequently use is the fact that we know through genetic studies now that each of us alive today has twice as many female ancestors as we do male ancestors. So historically, throughout time, about 80% of women who ever reached maturity were able to reproduce. Only about 40% of men historically were ever able to reproduce. As you said, men have been considered expendable. They were cannon fodder. They were worked to death in fields and were expected to sacrifice their lives for their families, for their country, for their communities. So that's a huge advantage. If you're talking about a balance of power between the sexes, women having double the genetics passed on, we're basically the choosers, right? We're basically the ones who select who gets to procreate and who doesn't. And people think, it was all arranged marriages or something, but that's really not true. That was more of the like upper classes and things like that in most parts of the world. So women had tremendous influence because we're selecting the genetics that are going to get passed on. We're choosing which men get to have children. And then through the family, through marriage, property is passed on, a legacy is passed on. And if you're going to have intergenerational wealth, it's going to be passed on through marriage and family, right? Which is one of the reasons Marxists love feminism and wanted to get rid of the dad, get rid of patriarchy, get rid of paternal lineage, because if men don't know who their progeny are, there is no incentive to build wealth. There is no incentive to have a legacy or to pass anything on because you don't even know which children are yours. So this is something that, again, was intentional to destroy that. And feminism created a situation where now in modern times today, we have women controlling about 85% of all consumer spending globally. Talk about power. Women control 85% of every consumer dollar spent. So all the marketing is aimed toward them. All of the research and development is aimed toward what they want. Everything revolves around what women will buy because they tend to buy everything from healthcare to insurance to consumer goods. Then on top of that, we now have, they're demanding equality in things like government positions, politics. We want 50% of CEOs to be female. We want 50% of people in STEM fields to be female. So we've got women in all these power positions and they control all the money and they still control who gets to procreate and they win in family courts, like way out of proportion to men. Women win in family courts. They get less time for a crime they would commit that's the exact same as a man. So they could commit the same crime as a man, get half the sentence, get half the penalty. Public opinion generally is very forgiving of women in their past, whereas it's not so much with men. You brought up the Me Too movement. That's another thing. So really what we have in modern times is a gross imbalance of power, where women hold a disproportionate amount of power compared to men. And the biggest problem with that is that who holds that power? Young women, right? Young, fertile, attractive women. Kylie Jenner made more money than any man the last couple of years in her, in entertainment and all of that stuff, retail, with her makeup and all of her different branding. She tripled what Kanye West made the last few years. So young, attractive, fertile women have an enormous amount of power that they have no idea what to do with because they're young and they're attractive, right? And they don't know that that is a very temporary part of their life. So it's really a disaster. And I go over all the effects of this in my book and kind of make the case that, hey, not only did this not turn out good for men, but it turned out horrible for women. And it turned out even worse for children. Arguably the biggest victims of feminism are children. They're growing up in broken homes without fathers, which puts them at high risk for just about every bad thing you can think of.
It's not just women they're trying to destroy with feminism. Men, they are trying to make you weak. And it's not just through the attacks in the media, it's also through a chemical warfare like the estrogenic chemicals that they put through microplastics and seed oils that actually end up blocking your hormones and actually deregulating your body, giving you this tired, fatigued, sort of weaker version of what God intended you to be. You might find yourself not having the muscle growth you want, the libido that you desire. And of course, they're happy about this. They continue to poison us. And we realize that this is actually happening scientifically from the data. Sperm count is down over 30% over the last several decades. And even worse, testosterone levels are shrinking by 1% year on end. If you want to reverse this factor, there's several things you can do. Number one, you've got to start lifting weights. Number two, you've got to get good sleep. You've really got to do that. And also a couple of things, including drinking water, is try Turkesterone by blackforestsupplements.com/slightly. Now, when you go to blackforestsupplements.com/slightly, you can get the Turkesterone that can help you overcome fatigue, can help increase muscle growth, and can give you that competitive edge that you might have felt like you lost as the New World Order wages war upon you. And it's absolutely amazing too, because it can also work for women because it's non-hormonal, and it's amazing. Right now, if you go to blackforestsupplements.com/slightly, that's BLACKFORESTSUPPLEMENTS.com/SLIGHTLY. Get 10% off right now Turkesterone for stamina increase, muscle growth increase. If you're looking to change your habits and help aid that with Turkesterone from blackforestsupplements.com/slightly. Click the link, get 10% off and check it out.